Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. You blew it on show day. Why? Because you didn't trial your peak week ahead of time like Luke does. And so that's why we have Luke here to help us to learn how he has trialed some different peak weeks with the competitors he just put on stage I think there are a few Australian clients, but someone else was in Sweden. That's right. So so Luke, thanks for having us and telling us all about your peaks. It'll be insightful.
I'm excited.
I know we have some people that like the idea of trialing a peak week, and there's a lot of nuance around it too, because it can't always be perfect, because once you're in your peak week, the environment changes, stressors on the competitor change. But for some individuals, it can be very consistent, while some you might have to do some extrapolating and also adjusting along the way. So I know we have these 3 clients to go over, so maybe we can start with maybe one of them and kind of lead into the other ones.
There. Well, yeah, I mean, so productive couple weeks over the last few weekends with shows. Had 2 overall wins, a class win, and 2 second places. So, pretty good output over the last 2 weeks across the last 2 show weekends. But we'll start with Emily. Obviously, the 2 overall wins with her at back-to-back shows. Her peak was pretty interesting. And the reason I say it is because she was ready so far ahead.
And sorry to interrupt you, Luke, but Emily, she's wellness, right? And she's competing at what level of show?
She's at a state regional level these last few. We'll do a pro qualifier next week. So
okay, gotcha. She
did 2 regional shows just to kind of get some stage practice, because she's coming from WBFF. So she's switching federations into IFBB. And so she wanted to get a good bit of stage practice before it was time to go for a pro card, and back-to-back overalls at both state shows. So we got some good momentum heading into the pro qualifier. But she was ready so early, almost, I don't want to say too early, but she came down so fast that I actually pulled her past wellness conditioning. So we planned only a 13-week prep or a 12-week prep, and she got into contest shape in 8 weeks. So at 4.5 weeks out, she was like ready. She was 57 kilos, and she was too hard for the wellness judging criteria, especially in Australia. They do lean a bit softer with the judging criteria there. So like we knew that kind of coming in. We had some pretty good feedback coming into the shows. So her baseline, like her peak low was, or her prep low was 57. We went into peak week at 59.5. And the reason we did this is because after a couple trial testings, we did see that there was a washout period that needed to happen with her. So 59 to 61 is kind of where we like the visuals, 61 being the fullest, 59 kind of being on the flatter, sharper side. And we kind of trialed the first peaking kind of like 3 weeks out. So we would run 3 days of loading going into that first trial run, where we did progressively higher high days kind of this first time, because I'm a little bit hesitant the first time I plug in food. So the first test basically went like 275 grams of extra carbs into the plan. Weight didn't jump. And then I did like 350 for the next 2 days. And the visuals would like keep progressing up until that last day. But then when she would come down to base plan, her pictures one day after would always be the best ones that we liked. There was fullness left. There was sharpness there that wasn't there after the 3 days of loading. So basically each time we trialed it, we just tested the different variables of how low did that day after loading need to be versus how high did the 3 high days need to be. And we basically just took that and used it for both shows. So we'd pull her down to 59 to 59.5, load her up into the 61-ish range, and then maintenance / slightly below maintenance, and get on stage between 60 to 60.5. And did it both times, and it worked like clockwork.
So just to like clarify, with that, she's starting loading at 57 kilogram throughout those 3 days. Is her body weight actually moving up in the mornings, Because you say her best was 59. So I assume after 3 days of loading, she wakes up at 59 kilogram. Then a couple meals in, she's at 61. Or
So she's
is that
starting at 59 because 57 was the prep low and it was too hard.
Okay.
So I brought her back up to 59 as like our start point.
So once that's kind of like and she's not so depleted, she's sitting at 59.
Yeah.
You load her to 61.
Yeah.
And then she falls a little bit back, and that's her best look.
Yeah. And so like it can even like somewhere and there's wiggle room on that, but 61 is like blasting full, just a bit too soft. So I know when I get her there, it's just like coasting at that point. And the reason this works is for two reasons. One, she needs the washout because the washout day is so crucial to her not looking too soft. But show day, she barely eats. There's a lot of midsection control. Both of my wellness girls, midsection control is just an issue with eating. So like she ate 2 meals that were a total of like 300 grams of rice between the 2 meals from wake up all the way to 3:30 p.m. for show day. So she's barely eating across show. Like she's waking up, doing her thing, kind of going about her day. We won't eat till like 9 or 10, and then we'll eat again around 1, and then we'll just get on stage. So it's like very minimal eating show day. And that's just from trialing this peaks with her. Like she would always look best after 1 meal, and it was largely a midsection control thing. Like when we talk about best visuals for waist, not just best visuals, like period.
And so that washout day, you go back to her baseline carbs. What do you do with proteins and fats? Does that change at all, or is that still like at her baseline?
Fats stay constant. I pull proteins down. So I actually cut her protein portions in half for that day. Again, for GI and just trying to keep, so veggies come out, protein comes down to half. And so it's actually not quite her base plan. It's slightly above her base plan, but it's what we consider maintenance. So her base plan that puts her in a deficit, it's like 160 protein, 155 carb, and then 40 fats. For that maintenance day for the washout, she's somewhere between 210 to 250, depending on how fast she's moving for the carbohydrates, and then proteins drop. So it's like kind of middle of the road for that washout day. And I'm really just trying to make sure she doesn't move up again or she doesn't drop too fast.
Now, I know on show day, you probably maybe do something with water, and then I want to know about the day before as well. And then are you doing that same thing during your trial? Because some people are like, well, how am I going to manipulate fluid also during my trial? So if you like kind of talk us through that and clarify what has to happen on the trial for you to be like, okay, that's good. I'll have enough data for show day. Then what'd you actually do on show day?
Yeah. So for the trial runs, there's just simple question asking, like how much fluid do you feel there's a crossover where midsection control starts to go worse? Because for her, I can influence fullness or flatness with the loading days leading in since I'm doing a washout, right? Because if it's like a backload situation where I have to push up, I'm having to use fluid and sodium as a part of that loading process, right? So I don't really have much wiggle room on what goes in. But if I push her up with normal fluid and normal sodium through those loading days, by the time we get to show day and we're kind of going through this washout and just holding a look, it's like I can just dose fluid based on holding this visual where it's at. And so what we found in the load testing is somewhere between 1 liter to 1.5 liters is right where midsection control feels the best, but she feels hydrated enough to kind of feel her poses and contract and pump up a little bit. And so that just came from comparing midsection control to fasted look versus post 1 meal versus end of day. So when I do trial peaking, I do weight collection, fasted, post-workout, and pre-bed. I do photo collection, fasted, post-workout, and then typically late in the afternoon 1 day because I'm trying to see if there's a drastic visual change for like super late if after many meals. So typically the last day of loading, I'm also doing afternoon photos.
I think a takeaway out of that too, because I know some people want photos after, like prior to every single meal, looking at weights to try to find this. Of course, you're able to kind of look across a range, right? And kind of find like, all right, probably between maybe post-workout and pre-bed might be the best look if you don't see it nailed between. However, the post-workout look could skew to where you might look the best. So do you find you have to, at times where this could go wrong, where you don't actually see the best look and but you have enough data to still go off of? Or would you advise someone to still look after every single meal to find that if they were newer in this?
You could in the trials, but I don't think it's necessary, because especially if you're doing multiple loading days, you're not getting the same weight data each time you take photos, right? Because when she takes fasted photos before loading, she's down at 59. But when she takes fasted photos day 2, she's like 59.5. When she takes fasted photos day 3, she's 60. So you're getting different data points across the days of loading, whether you like it or not, where you should be able to start to narrow that range of, okay, my preference is to find the cross point of where's too full. If I know that cross point, then I know that's just like, that's no man's land, and just got to keep it below that. And then how close I get to that is how long she has to hold it. So with it being a washout period, so a day and a half before we have to get on stage, I get really close to that no man's land. I basically pull it right up to it and then just let it fall.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're going to see throughout all those different pictures her weights and visuals to give you that range. So it's not necessarily even throughout the day you need every single photo and all the variations of it. It's more like, hey, from 59 to let's call it like 62, right? You see enough variation within that where you're like, aha, she's best at right at 60, let's say, versus needing every single data point to compare, because it could get a bit overwhelming, I think, for someone to look at.
So what I do is in my spreadsheet for peak week, I have all these data metrics on a kind of like a spreadsheet that goes down. So it's each day before peak week. And then I just highlight the visuals I like the best typically, so that I know that those are my data points that we're kind of sitting at our best visuals. I didn't have to do it with her because like I got 3 trial runs before the show. So it'd be like, it's just so much data. It's like, if I screw this up, like, what am I doing? Right.
Another thing I wanted to bring up, because in prepping, the environment's a lot different in this. For some people, the stressors and psychology around, hey, I'm just in prep, versus you're at the show, you're now in a hotel room, maybe cardio or output changes. Did that impact her at all? And then how do you circumvent that if you do have someone that's in that situation where their like prep trial is vastly different from their peak week? Yeah.
So she's pretty experienced where she doesn't let the hype of a show like get her nervous. She does want to pace a bit backstage, which is, God bless her husband, Matt, because he's like back there making sure that she's not pacing for me. Obviously the first show I was there, right? So I was able to do that, but she ended up being about half a kilo lighter that first show than the second show. And you can see it. Like, I will definitely lean towards the second show visuals that are about a kilo higher, because, and I think it was largely because she paced a bit more that first show day than she did the second. And so like, obviously it's her first show in the IFBB. There's like a lot, pressure wise, but it's not too bad for her because she just kind of goes about her day. She's extremely experienced. She's actually the special case where I prepped her entirely on macros this whole prep. I like, to the point that I trust her enough where I send her macros for the day. She builds out her plan for the day, sends it to me, and I approve it or disapprove it. Like, she's that good. So, that's kind of where, like, the last day I'll pick foods, but that's it. Like, she's so versed where I don't have to worry about it. Now, for people who it does bring that anxiety up and you start to pace and things start to move a bit quick, this is where I tend to lean a little bit more aggressive come show weekend, because I can always drip food back on show day. So if I'm loading someone, I'd rather go to bed too full because I know they're going to drop and I know that I'm going to not have to feed them a lot on show day. And if you stay aggressive early, you're never going to fall behind. Where issues start to happen, in my opinion, is when you fall behind because you push food so hard, so late that GI distress is going to potentially come up. You're never going to get them actually to being all the way full, which means they're probably less responsive. So it's taking more to get them moving up. that's where I would be. I will say now I do a lot less linear loading because of it.
And I could see if you have someone where you're not able to trial them, you should load them early because it's much easier to hold the glycogen load versus, like you're saying, trying to get there too late. So if you do like, hey, starting on Wednesday for the Saturday show, load them hard, then you can pull back. And that's like the best case versus waiting till the late Thursday evening. Sometimes we have people that start loads or Friday. And then you're like, oh, they went too far or not there at all, which is more problematic because then you're trying to put more food in on show day and then you're having waste issues, which can be problematic for every division, especially we see it more so for your big guys that really need to bring their waist down. But I think being able to have that valuable insight is definitely important for those that might not be able to have all the trialing like an Emily would. But now you had someone else compete in the same show as her, the same division, right?
And got second,
right, with a little bit different situation for her.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to today's podcast. Are you struggling to hit your peak on show day? Feeling lost in the off season? Upgrade your coaching game with J3 University. Our program covers everything from off season to contest prep to peak week, all based from real client results. Along with our comprehensive physique curriculum, you'll also get access to our 4 rooms with our J3U team to answer any questions you have and live Q&A sessions to further your coaching and athlete experience. We are the source of education for top IFBB pros and coaches. Join us to elevate the coaching standard at J3 University. Let's get back to today's podcast.
Yeah, so I got less peak trials with her. I did get, I believe, 2, if I remember correctly, 1 partial. The first one was just like, let's get fatigue back and let's see kind of how much that changes the visuals. The second one would, in my opinion, would be like the actual peak test. And the interesting thing with her is her name's Mel. Shout out Mel. She's such a hard worker. She's so good at taking like the videos and the data and labeling it in the folder according to what day and time it is. It's so organized. I love it. So when she like drops them in there, like we did a 3-day loading parameter for the first test. And what was cool with her was that like, as she was loading, I originally thought 2 days of loading was going to be my favorite because day 3 she spilled. And I was like, okay, this is too much. And then what ended up happening is as she went back to base diet, it was like the visuals were so much better from a waist perspective after pulling it back down to low food that it was the same fullness as day 2 with a slightly smaller waist. So what I did with her is instead of pushing her up to the brink of that no man's land, I actually pushed her in the no man's land. So Sunday show for them, Saturday midday, she hit, I'm trying to remember the exact number, but it was about 1 kilo above where I liked her on stage. And then I just basically barely fed her the rest from midday Saturday all the way into showtime Sunday at 3:30. So it was like protein veg the back end of the day, Saturday, and then like 3 rice cake meals on Sunday for show day.
So get her up quick, 1 day out, and basically just held there the rest of the time.
No, just drop it down because like she'll drop
Actually,
that kilo.
Drop her, okay.
Yeah. So and the reason I did that was because in the loading practice I spilled her, and then it came back down to my favorite look. So I didn't want to try to play this holding game, like not spill her and she start to run away from me. And so I was like, well, I know that she's going to drop at this rate if I spill her like this. So I'm just going to do the same thing. And so it was a product of seeing the peak testing work so well. Why would you not run the same? Because from a waist control perspective for her, she's even more sensitive and her waist gets like 24 inches when it's like empty. And it helps her visuals so much that if I can really keep food and fluid out of her on show day, it really helps her with midsection control. Like she even said that this is probably the best she's felt her midsection all prep on stage because of how little was in it by the time we got to stage time, 3:30-ish in the afternoon.
You might want to explain to everyone. I know what you mean, but when you're stating for her to run away, what do you?
Yeah. So running away is like she starts to drop at a rate that's hard to keep up with. So like, and I can't remember the data exactly, but let's just say 59.5 is a spilled over look, and that 58.5 is kind of where I like her. If I only push her up into like that 58.5 range and try to hold her, she could potentially start dropping where I had to start putting food back in to hold her. And now I'm losing the midsection control. So like it's taking more and more and more to hold her at 58.5 than it originally would have because of the show weekend and the steps and the pacing and all that and everything that's happening. So I'd rather push her up 24 hours out, spilled, and just let it coast back down, because then I know I'm not going to have to put much food in her. And this is where I'll use so when I build this matrix, I put an amount of carbohydrates and fats that drop someone, amount of carbohydrates and fats that hold them, and amount of carbohydrates and fats that push them up. And it's by a poundage range. So the first one drops them a pound, the second one holds them, the third one brings them up a pound. And that way I can use that as to relative to where they are. So basically I was just feeding her with somewhere in that range of drop a pound to hold with each meal. As long as she did what I thought she would do, it was pretty much just rinse and repeat.
And on that point, are you strategizing food sources when you move people? Because on potentially what I'm thinking is during your trial, you might be using different foods than you actually used for your actual show day, or even when you're trying to hold her with the smallest food volumes possible. And does that ever change even the type of food source or macro percentage you use? Like, hey, I'm going to really bring fats up as they're more dense, or use some type of like really low volume carbohydrate. Did that influence any changes for Mel? Or in general, for another client, you might see a different situation?
It's a great question for her because it did change protein source selection for her. So she has a couple proteins in her diet. I think there's like egg whites, whole eggs, chicken, and there's one more, protein powder. And she actually, like, coming into peak week was like, hey, these egg whites sit so well on me. So if we can just not use chicken the entire show day, that'd be great. Which is odd. Most people from an egg whites perspective get like the GI distension, right? But like, so this is, and I love this point because this is the one that I wanted to bring up with her. It's like, if I use strictly my experience of like previous data with other clients and I stay gung-ho on egg whites ruin digestion for people, I miss an opportunity to use something specific to the client. Where for her, she said that to me and I'm like, yeah, let's just prep them ahead of time. So we had 3 egg whites for 2 meals ready for our show day meals. And I gave her 3 egg whites in the first meal. I halved it for the second one just because it got a little closer to the show time than I wanted. And we were perfect. And digestion was the best. She stated that like her GI was or her stomach control was the best it's ever been. But that's an unconventional change for me. I would typically go the route of removing egg whites for most people because it uses it for like bloating and hunger control and things like that. But for her case, it worked. And from a carb perspective, like, we had trialed a couple different ones and we kind of landed on rice cakes as like the best digestion. So we just used rice cakes pretty much the whole time.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we see a lot of peak weeks are people just eating just meat, right? Like beef and chicken and turkey. It's like, gosh, there's so much volume and it takes forever for some of this stuff to digest. Like on show day, eating that, man, it just doesn't make a lot of sense sometimes.
Wait till you get to Charbel's. Charbel's is so fun. We'll get to that in a second, but go ahead.
Yeah. It's like, even like with whey protein, people are like, you have to cut out whey on peak week. You need to cut out egg whites on peak week. But if some people digest it really well and the volume, at least for whey, could be made really small, or egg whites can digest really easy for some people. So no, very good points to be had about just catering nutrition and peak week strategy around individual response and preference. But let's move on to your last guy, because you had a unique one with your final competitor. And what was his trialing period like for him? Because he's classic, but he had a weight cap to make too.
Yeah, so we didn't get a ton of trial data for him. We got a little bit. It was just like 2 days of loading, I believe like 14 days out, where I've prepped him before, so I know how his peaks go. The interesting part is the prep was ran better this time. So last year he used to run away from me a lot. Like I loaded him for 7 days, I believe, into the last show last time. Or this time, fatigue was so much lower that he wasn't doing that. So he's way more responsive, which was nice because it's less stress on my end. His interesting case is what happened during peak week. So the trial data, like we knew we were going to have to backload. It was just a product of making weight. He had added about 7 kilos of muscle. So he went from about 5 kilos below the cap to about 2 kilos above the cap. So, which for freedom units, that's like 4.5 pounds above the cap. And so what ended up happening with him is he just had a moment of weakness, and God bless Charbel, because he's such a hardworking athlete. Like it's so uncharacteristic of him. But I'm in the airport in Australia taking a flight to a different part because we're going to see like more of the country. And he's like, man, I messed up. And I know that text message, right? Like, you know what's coming after that. It's like, okay, well, just tell me what happened. He's like, I ate 6,000 calories in like 5 minutes. And kind of like John, when we talked about this off air, I was like, first off, how did you do that so quickly? Second off, what did the weight jump so I know what I need to do? So his weight jumped, I believe, 5 kilos. So like 11 pounds in that time frame, which put us at like 85.5, 86, which is like 6 kilos above his cap. So that would have been Tuesday. No, that would have been Monday night. So Tuesday and Wednesday, we did protein veg. That would have been Tuesday. So Wednesday, Thursday, we did protein veg. And the last like Friday, Thursday into Friday, which Fridays is weigh-ins, he ate 4 meals of protein veg. So we were 45 minutes cardio protein veg Wednesday. Weight dropped about 2.5 kilos. Wakes up Thursday. I'm like, man, like if we don't like get pretty aggressive here, this is not going to happen. We used a diuretic. So we used HCZ and triamterene that night with 4 meals of chicken and veg across the day. So it was 1 less meal total. I think he dropped the veggie out of the last meal. What's similar to a Diazide, it's just a different company or it's a different brand name. That night, Thursday, and then Friday woke up pretty much right on the weight cap. So basically just fasted until about midday, gave him a little bit of food because he dropped below, and then loading, because it was Friday weigh-ins for a Sunday show. So I now had Friday afternoon and Saturday to load him.
That's fortunate. So
that was so nice, because to mess up like that a couple of days out, like I'm going to have to start to pull things out that I wouldn't have used to get him into under the cap, like the protein veg days, the less meals on the day before weigh-ins, the Diazide, the night leading into before weigh-in day, the fasting kind of throughout Friday before he gets to weigh in. So there's a lot that's done that I wouldn't have had to do if we wouldn't have had that binge. But
just
what was
triage
interesting
at that point.
It's complete triage. Like I'm talking like this dude is checking in with me like every couple hours. So, so we do that, make weight, all's good. Loading for him is interesting. So rice doesn't sit too well on his stomach. We knew that almost the entirety of prep. So we used rice cakes mostly on, from a loading perspective, but we actually use granola and Pop-Tarts. And so the granola for 100 grams is like 10 grams of fat and 65 grams of carbs. So I would do mixture meals of rice cakes and granola, pretty much all loading for the entirety of Saturday. And then Sunday on show day, every single meal was whey, granola, and nut butter.
That's a different combination. It just seems so dry to me. I know it's not, but I remember one show was that some guy was eating like dry oats uncooked backstage. I'm like, oh my God. No. But no, I know granola is not like that. Like it has the added fats and sugars, so it's easy to have some saliva actually happen. But
so it was completely volume based. And so his best visual was like right at 80 kilos. So Saturday loading him up, I got him up to like 81.4 before bed. He dropped a little bit overnight, and basically Saturday I just held him right there at 80.5 to 81, and we're good to go. It was so easy. Like I can remember this data exactly because it was so much triage that entire week that it's scarred in my brain. Thank you, Charbel. So Sunday morning we woke up slightly below 81. We did 700 milliliters of water with 2 grams of sodium in it, leading into first show time at 9 a.m. That first meal would have been, I believe, 60 grams of granola with a scoop of whey. And that was the only thing that was done pre-show. And then we just rinsed and repeated granola, nut butter, and whey kind of between each time he was on stage. So he had a stage at 9 a.m., then he had another stage around noon. We did 130 grams granola with a little bit of nut butter between. Another 700 mLs of fluid with 2 grams of sodium between classic and bodybuilding. As soon as bodybuilding got off, he had an hour before classic finals. We did another 120 grams granola with a little bit of jam so that it sat easy. And then we went and did classic finals, and then we rinsed and repeated another granola and nut butter. And he stood on stage at 81 kilos every time he walked out.
That's nice to have that consistency. And once you find the right food and water combination,
so
just
easy.
Rinse and repeat it. It's like nothing needing to reinvent the wheel there. One thing I wanted to ask, because we didn't really address it with your other clients that you had on stage, is like, are you typically doing fluid with a certain X amount of sodium always? Or how does that impact these other clients that you were peaking?
Yeah, so Charbel's is interesting because he puts his sodium in his water. So like throughout the day. So that's why I was dosing sodium and fluids together because I knew the rate of fluid and sodium together that he does throughout the day from the data that we had done in the peaking. The other girls do it per meal. So with the girls, what I'm doing is normal sodium per meal, unless I say otherwise. Like if I need to push them up, I'll add a little bit more. If I need to pull them down, I might pull a little bit out. But most of the time I'm keeping it constant. For both of those peaks, I kept it constant. I just said, hey, normal sodium for every meal. And then fluid was constant until show day. I think Emily walked on stage with 1.25 liters and Mel was like 1.1. But with Charbel, his was sodium and fluid because of him doing those together. So that's where like the data collection is important to understand how people are managing their fluid and sodium so that you can keep it as consistent as possible throughout.
So far, Charbel, though, like his sodium stayed the same, but his fluid would have come down, right?
Yeah. So that was just me trying to keep him a little bit, keep him full, but not have much fluid in his stomach because he loses his vacuum ability if there's too much.
Yeah, I think with that, like people are like, well, wouldn't that start causing water retention occur? Like, because yeah, you are driving up sodium with low amounts of water. At some point, that could provide like a kickback, but it's not going to happen on show day. And the benefits of having the extra sodium for uptake of the carbohydrate, contractions on stage, having enough blood pressure to just get a pump and everything that comes about with that is needed.
And it was slightly lower than his normal rate too, because he takes in 9 grams of sodium across 9 liters across a day.
Okay.
And he was only in like 5 grams of sodium by the time he finished finals for classic, which would have been mid-afternoon. So it is slightly slower than his usual rate of sodium intake. It was just relative to the amount of fluid that's going in, it's a little bit more, but it's still slightly lower. So it was not like I'm just loading sodium relative to his baseline. It's just relative to what he usually consumes. And that's kind of where I kind of found those numbers.
Okay. No, that's all really insightful, Luke. I think with trialing peak weeks, there's going to vary so differently from client to client because you'll have more ability to trial with some will be very limited, but at least you have I think the big thing here is being able to watch the client like you would on a trial during your peak week to quickly make the calls to make those adjustments along the way and just finding the best weight and visual and doing your best to get them on stage around that. I think peak week can get a bit overly complicated when some people are trying to manipulate so many things when it can be simply coming down to still like just finding the best visual and weight and manipulating all those variables to let them arrive at that when they do walk on stage.
Yeah. I think if you just understand how people respond to these different variables aggressively or non-aggressively, it makes it so much clearer like which ones you actually have to do anything with. And 9 times out of 10, food is aggressive enough to move them in any direction that you need them to go. If you're triaging, fluid and sodium changes or, diuresis or anything like that will have to happen, but it's like emergency case situations.
I think that's great. And so for any of you that want to learn more about peak week, we have our J3U level 1 course that dives into our contest prep and peak week lectures. We also have the female module, which has specifics on peak week just for females. And also along with that, if you need coaching and you want someone to guide you through the process, we even have our J3U coaches that know exactly what we're talking about here and are experts at it. So all those links are in our show notes below. Thanks, Luke, for all the insight for these like case studies, which are so valuable. And we'll any questions, just leave them down below and we'll talk to everyone next time.